Hello and welcome to Executive Sessions. I'm your host, Dr. Rod Berger. We're being joined by educational leaders from across the U.S. to break down the topics impacting our industry and communities during challenging times. I'd like to thank those that have helped bring this conversation together. I'd like to thank Strategist Group, developing and influencing through change expertise, and to our friends at EDSB, the K-12 platform of the future today. This is going to be a fantastic conversation. We've already been chatting off air. We've got Dr. Susan Enfield, Highline Public Schools Superintendent in Washington State. We have Dr. Steve Joel, Superintendent of Lincoln Public Schools, and Dr. Michael Duncan, Pike County Schools, just down the road from me in Georgia. Mike, it's nice to officially meet you. I've spent time with Susan and Steve, so I'm excited about this conversation. I want to start with this. So we talked off air that there's so many topics in education that I have been privy to off the record from leaders like yourselves that are sort of under the umbrella of COVID and all the kinds of things that we're seeing in popular press and on our local news coverage. But there's so many things going on in education and decisions that have to be made at your level and amongst your leadership that we don't really get to hear about, but have incredible implications for teaching and learning now and into the future. So, Steve, I want to start with you because we've had a number of conversations in the past. And what I've always appreciated about your work in Lincoln is, one, you are very keen on community coalitions and engaging the community in what Lincoln does as a city and a metropolitan area in education. Let's talk about trust and the role trust plays in communicating specifically with parents, because if COVID did anything, it flipped our communication patterns on their head, right? On its head, and said, the way we used to do it may not work. Parents are going to want different types of information. And if we, in essence, don't do it correctly or right or better, we may erode trust that had been built up over years. How have you approached trust and communicating with parents?
Well, great question, Rod. So COVID has, I think, changed all of our environments in with regard to not only what the pandemic represents, but also the politics associated with the pandemic, with Black Lives Matter, with how we're approaching some of our strategies, the equity work that we're doing, the misinformation surrounding critical race theory. So in sleepy little Lincoln, where board meetings used to last, no more than 40, 45 minutes, we now have anywhere from 25 to 50 speakers that are upset about some of one of those, right? So
wow.
We've gotten smarter now. We ask them to identify what they're angry about when they show up at the board meeting so that we don't go from one topic to the other without some continuity. Having said that, one of the key functions I see my role being is to make sure that our administration, our administrative team, our teachers, and certainly our board understand that while we're living in this very, very difficult time known as, I don't know, we can call it anything we want, but just a very tough time. The end of the day, 95% of the people in Lincoln and 95% of our parents do support the work that we're doing because we've been so transparent, because we've taken time to meet them where they are. In Lincoln, for example, and I'm sure Mike and Susan will tell a very similar story. We use groups of people on a regular basis. We just build it into the culture. So we have 2 or 3 community groups. One of them that represents all business leaders, high echelon business leaders in Lincoln. We have several parent groups, on the ground parent groups that represent all of our buildings. And then most recently, as a result of Black Lives Matter, we've really stepped up our my personal involvement in student groups. So we're out there having conversations while arrows are flying overhead at the board level and comments from our governor and when we went through January 6th and what happened, what didn't happen, what do you believe, what do you not believe? At the end of the day, I just truly believe it's incumbent upon superintendents to keep your networks alive and well and communicate, because at the end of the day, I'm 100% convinced in Lincoln that if I made a couple of key phone calls in 5 minutes and just said, the school district needs you, we would overwhelm our boardroom with those that are basically saying, we're not going to get involved in this discussion. Unless you tell us you need our help, we're with you. Keep high quality education at the forefront. And where that manifests itself is that bond issues passed by close to 70% here. And we passed one just 1 month before the pandemic for 2 new high schools. And again, we have to remind ourselves of that because I'm in an environment right now in Lincoln where myself and school board members have to be walked out to our cars by security because some of the people that are showing up are so angry, so threatening, and they really don't know what they're mad about. They're just mad. And I think that pretty much defines what America's facing right now.
So thank you for that, Steve. Susan, I guess it begs the question. So we can either sort of hit this head on and sort of, do we argue or communicate in a way that just keeps this perpetuating, right, over time? And, I hate to hear Steve having to be escorted out and others in his, leadership team. But sadly, that's not a unique story, right? We're hearing that across the country. One area might be in how we look at, we're talking about communication here and trust. So is this really about a social learning community, about understanding the different types of things that we want to communicate with our parents, like adding other areas? Because I think that parents they become more invested, hopefully, in the learning of their child or their children. And so there's an awareness that has come that I don't think was there previously. And we can maybe pass judgment or not. Previously, we kind of just assumed our kids were learning and we've got life going on. But my goodness, with COVID, we were having to look and participate in that learning as adults with our children. So how does that impact communication in sort of what we communicate, through what platforms, how we do it? Because it feels like when you see it done right in a district, it really feels right. But when it's breaking down, it's everything from transportation to, you name the department in the district, and we're finding just sort of random acts of communication that need a little more kindness. So how are you looking at sort of that entire sphere of communication? And is it more about creating a social learning community with your parents?
So, trust doesn't just happen magically or instantaneously. Trust is born out of relationships. And relationships don't happen magically or instantaneously. They're cultivated over time. And what the conversation I'd like to see happening out of this, well, there are many conversations I would like to see happening out of this chapter in our collective lives, but one of those is around leadership stability in our school districts. I'm entering my 10th year in Highline Public Schools. Mike, I don't know what year this is for you. I know Steve has been at the helm of Lincoln for quite some time. We have deep relationships within our community. So when the pandemic hit, we, as Steve, I think, really beautifully illustrated, we had people to go to partner with, to ask for help. But you think about that first or second year superintendent who is new to the community, and, my heart just goes out to them. That has to be tough. But, the reason that, perhaps, we see so many first and second year soups is because of that leadership turnover. And I don't think we talk enough about leadership instability in our school systems and the impact that has, not just on the system to thrive and for our children to achieve, but for those relationships to be built, because it does take time. And so I'd like for us to have a conversation around how communities can really work toward, electing school boards that are committed to staying the course and doing the right thing, rather than coming on board for one particular pet project or pet peeve. Hiring superintendents who are committed, as I like to say, to live, lead, and serve in a community, not just to take a job. And I think that is an important conversation. I will take that further into the point that you just made, Rod, around I think this real awakening that both our school staff and our families have had over the last 18 months. When, we all first went into distance learning because our school buildings closed, it became abundantly clear very quickly to our families how much they needed school staff, teachers, counselors, principals. It became equally abundantly clear to our school staff how much they needed families. For this to work, for our kids to be able to keep learning, to stay in school via, their computer, this was going to have to be a team effort. And so one of the other things that I'd like to see us talking about is how are we sustaining and strengthening those teams of home and school in service of a child's success. So I have talked in many times about what I call #TeamKid. So let's go beyond the parent and family engagement. Let's go beyond parent and family partnership. Let's talk about teaming. How are we working as one team? Because, and again, I'll go to the next point that Steve, raised. We are so fractured right now, so divided. And, we really have to come together as communities to collectively wrap our arms around our kids and not let those issues that have become so polarizing divide us. We've got to get back to a place, Rod, when it comes to communication, where we can actually communicate. We're not communicating right now. We are just emoting. We are just projecting. We are just yelling. We are just, putting out there whatever it is, we feel. And we've got to get back to a place where we hear someone. I'll give an example and then I'll pass it back to you. I actually had my first in-person disgruntled parent meeting yesterday. It was beautiful. It was like, this is great.
You're smiling.
I haven't had parents in my office, and it was great. We were fully masked and distanced, but I was like, this is awesome. And they came in to share some concerns around their perceptions of, it was really grounded in I think that the misinformation around CRT and what it is and what it isn't, but also what was happening in their middle schoolers, history classroom. And I think it would be easy for me as a leader to just write them off and say, well, they just don't get it. They're misinformed and I disagree with their stance. And instead I really listened. And, they had some valid points. Now, at the end of the day, we may still not agree, but we really heard each other. And we agreed at the end of that conversation to keep the conversation going and to agree to disagree in a respectful way. And I think we need to get back to that, because right now everyone is sort of on their hind legs in defensive mode. And when you're in defensive mode, you're not really listening and engaging genuinely.
I so appreciate you brought up sort of it's the easy button kind of a thing, right? That we could fall back or lean into that. Mike, you've been SOUP since 2005, if my research is correct. So you could argue that, boy, if there's anybody that has the backing and the support of the community to stand pat, it potentially is you. I don't get that sense because you've been superintendent of the year 2021 in Georgia, right? So that's not in your nature to do that. But let's take ESSER funds for an example, right? So there's this current and this conversation I keep hearing from these different camps of superintendents, right? We're talking about, are we going to take the easy road? Or are we going to start to be progressive and look at things a little bit differently and not fear failure? Think about that in just the classroom setting, and can we embody that as leaders? But I hear superintendents talking about sort of their colleagues, professional colleagues, and even neighboring districts that in essence are sort of practicing the same spending habits that they have for years and wanting them to be more creative, more thoughtful about these funds to help support growth and development of a district. That to me is also part of this sort of this wheel of trust, this circle of trust, is that can I count on my local superintendent and leaders to be looking at things in potentially different ways, right? I know there are staffing issues, there are all kinds of issues. But let's take ESSER as an example. Is that something that you are hearing? How should we be thinking about that as communities, as an opportunity to grow?
Rod, I think it's a great question. In talking to superintendents around our state, as I've had the opportunity as superintendent of the year to go and speak to different regional groups, one of the things that I've been discussing is, in times of crisis and when things are very chaotic, you have to anchor back to your mission and your core values and your beliefs. And how clearly do your community know your mission and your beliefs? Are you living those beliefs every day? Can they see evidence of those beliefs? Does your staff know those core values? Do they know the guardrails of why decisions are made? And so we have a very clear set of governing principles that we use, whether it's for ESSA funds, whether it's in how we respond to a governor mandated shutdown or locally controlled reopening, whatever it is always being able to communicate back the decisions you're making through the lens of your mission, your vision, your purpose, your core beliefs, and your core values. And so that has been really important to us. And we've done a lot of work in that area, really solidifying those governing principles. And it has really helped us in the way that we have communicated. And so for us, there has been an incredible amount of trust and support because even through COVID, we have stayed on message. And in our district, we have a mission of developing creative problem solvers. And that all started many, many years ago with the adoption of a graduate profile and moving toward 21st century outcomes and deeper learning. And so even through COVID, as we were communicating how we were going to facilitate instruction during the shutdown, how we were going to spend our ESSER funds, it was always through that lens of developing creative problem solvers, and it was always tagged back to those beliefs in our purpose statement. And so, if those are things that you just do every 5 years when you're redoing your strategic planning, or when you have Cognia that's coming to reaccredit you and you remind everyone of what your mission and beliefs are, you probably don't have the advantage to anchor your ship to that. And so for us, we've navigated this uncertain time, I believe, very well, because our community knew what our purpose was. They knew what our beliefs were, and we stayed true to that. And we communicated using that language. And that's been very helpful for us. So when we were looking at how we were going to be spending our ESSA funds, there was a lot of needs. But there was a lot of safety needs. But we also knew that there was an opportunity for us to do some professional growth and some professional development. And we're a small rural district about an hour south of Atlanta. We've been in the bottom 5 of per pupil expenditure for the entire 17 years I've been school superintendent. And so we don't have a lot of extra money running around. But we saw these funds as a way to accelerate our professional development and bring parents in as part of design teams to create tools to help them with our deeper learning initiatives. And so a lot of it was about staying on message. So if you went into this with a 21st century outlook, a deeper learning concept for your instructional program, staying on message to us was very successful.
Did it create an opportunity, Mike, to really audit yourselves as a district on what you've been spending or not? I mean, from the parent side of the table or the Zoom, very quickly parents would realize, oh, wait a minute, there are all these applications that my child has access to that all of a sudden are gone or growing. And so does that impact it? It's sort of, boy, when the spotlight is on us, maybe we start to look at how are we spending? What's the impact? Is that going to change that trust, right? Equation in this and what we're communicating around learning and teaching and growth? I mean, obviously you have to be very diligent because you are in the bottom 5 in what you're receiving in that regard. And so, you do not want to sort of randomly spend pennies where you don't have them or need them. But how do you look at that in that regard? Because it feels like there were a lot of districts that sort of looked in the mirror and said, do we really need this? Or boy, we need to beef up this area of technology or support.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And for us, a lot of it was around technology. Since we're a rural community, we only have about 35% of our students that have access to reliable high-speed internet. So there was not an opportunity for us to transition to this virtual environment and continue to carry forward our deeper learning philosophy. And so we had to be very innovative in how we were communicating that work and how we were doing it. And so we've been engaged, like many districts have, in project-based learning for many, many years. And so interestingly enough, when we went into the shutdown the very first time, our teachers were really out of pocket and we didn't have the ability to bring them back in. Our leaders developed the content and the lessons for our schools during the shutdown. And so it was a great opportunity to see principals and assistant principals and instructional coaches and central office teaching and learning to develop meaningful project-based learning experiences that continued to grow and foster our graduate profile competencies. But what that revealed to us, Rod, was that we realized that our parents needed more clarification and more tools about our instructional design and how they could help support them. And so we held a focus group this fall. We had a parent design team that built out 2 parent-facing tools to help them with our instructional expectations. And so it was about communicating how we're spending our money to continue to accelerate our vision for student achievement and what that means to us. And so technology was a big piece of that. But what we heard all around our community, where there's much more high-speed internet penetration, was that parents for the first time were seeing the high levels of clerical, low cognitive work that students were being engaged in. And so in all of the communities surrounding us, there was a lot of social media that was out there about just the low level of rigor that students were being engaged in through the virtual environment. And so our parents took this tremendous pride in we weren't doing that. Students were engaged in high level, rigorous project-based learning activities while school was shut down. And so our community took a great deal of pride in that. And so, once again, it was about making the connection between what we want for students and how we were spending that money.
Steve, if we do an autopsy on Lincoln's technology, you sort of look retroactively at sort of where it either dropped the ball for you or where, my goodness, we didn't realize this value. Kind of walk us into those conversations. I mean, I've heard people talk about we need to sort of blow up our understanding of learning management systems and how we're documenting learning and communicating with parents, because I'll speak as a parent. My kids are in elementary school and they came from pre-K programs where I had access to what they were doing all day long on my phone. Right. And I had conversations with my local district that said, what's going to happen when they they matriculate into your system? And they said, oh, we don't do that here. And I said, well, I think you've got a tidal wave of parents coming that have an expectation. And this is pre-COVID. I can only imagine what that's like now. So where did technology either fail or support you in ways that you guys in your district didn't anticipate?
Well, first of all, Rod, let me say that I want to go back to something that both Mike and Susan talked about. The ESSER dollars have been a godsend in so many ways, right? So I don't think anybody would say we don't need those dollars. And they came at the right time, and they came with very few rules and structures in place. So we had the ability to think outside the box. But here's what I'm worried about for those that have more years in the profession left than I do. And that is, what's the narrative going to be at the end of all of this with regard to how those dollars return to yield on investment? And most people would say in education, it's student outcomes, right? It's student achievement. How are we going to express that narrative? Because the reality of it is, I think we're all faced with the fact that this pandemic put us into a position that, despite being, and Susan and I are charter members of the League of Innovative Schools, and we've been a one-to-one district for a number of years, and we trained on technology, and we hired, every building had access to an instructional technology coach. I mean, we felt like we were about as close to ready as anyone was. And I would tell you, we didn't do well. We didn't do well for the reasons that Mike suggested, with regard to who had access and who didn't have access. We didn't do well because teachers almost immediately, when we asked them to create a hybrid environment, became exhausted and just were not able to do their best work. And by their own admission said, I've got 8 kids in a Zoom environment. I've got 8 in my classroom. I cannot meet the needs of my Zoom children. And, we had a lot of parents that opted for Zoom because that was the safest bet. And I think there was a little bit of a false narrative that we were ready to meet that demand. And we found that we weren't able to meet that demand. And in fact, as recently as yesterday, we were peeling apart our state data, our state achievement data, and clearly to us, I mean, without question, the chart goes up on the board, and we see that the schools, we have 36 elementaries, the schools with the highest percentage of Zoom learners last year did the poorest in terms of where they were predicted to score. And so, as much as America was saying, we appreciate the multi-million dollars worth of investments in technology, we're preparing kids for their future, not our past. And, work from home is going to be a thing that, we're never going to get away from. If it's not this pandemic, it's going to be the next pandemic. The reality of it is, I'm very, very safe in saying and free in saying that there is no substitute for in-person instruction, and every one of our teachers would agree to that. So, I don't know how we're going to regain the lost ground of last year. We're using our ESSER dollars for that purpose, with instructional tutoring, extended learning opportunities, and trying to. We just recently, in the last couple of weeks, decided to use our ESSER dollars now to create we had so many kids that are being quarantined and placed into seclusion that we're now going to form. We're using audio enhancement product that not only magnifies hearing in classrooms, but now they've had it for a while. There's a video component. We've got 24 volunteer teachers that we're going to pay an ungodly sum of money to create lessons for kindergarten through 5th grade in math and ELA. We're using ESSER dollars for that because the gaps that we have right now between those that tried to learn remotely and those that made it to school are pretty stark. And so I want to go back to how I started. I'm talking a lot about public education's been under attack in so many different areas, right? So it's funding, it's achievement, it's whatever. And we as educators have advocated long and hard. I know I have for 35 years. We just can't do everything a community wants us to do. We don't have the resources. All of a sudden, the resources are there. Did we deploy those resources strategically enough to continue to build trust and strengthen trust with our communities that would say, you did it? I worry about that because I do think that that the gaps are pretty wide right now.
Steve, I'm curious if we talk about sort of evaluating what's out there. So, I mean, it's terribly sad and powerful message when you talk about the data that's revealed and the kids that were sort of Zoom educated and the impact that had on their learning. And now what you're doing to help support that or the growth, right, and sort of catch them up. How confident should the American public be in general? So this is more of you sort of as an analyst in the space, as a superintendent, and one who's been doing it for a number of years. But how confident should we be that the same people in leadership positions have the skills and the background to evaluate what is being deployed throughout districts that can impact teaching and learning, right? Because you'll hear stories, to the side at conferences that some of these districts are spending astronomical amounts and they have incredible numbers of apps that they've brought on board. Their teachers don't even know they have that, right? There's so much, right? It's just, are we trimming the fat? Do we even know how can we evaluate effectively? Are we better spenders? Are we more disciplined spenders? So where would you rate the confidence that a parent should have?
Rod, that's $1 million question, right? So here's what I would answer this with this statement. One of the things we are horrible at in public education is what I call selective abandonment. We add things all the time. We never take anything away because somebody's married to it, right? Somebody would say, well, that yielded 2 percentage points on the math assessment. So, even though we're not using it very much, let's keep it in. And we're trying to undergo that kind of an audit system. In terms of confidence, I would say this. I do believe, and I speak for every one of my colleagues across the country, I do believe that they should have, I'm talking about the public now, should have confidence in the fact that we're trying to do the very, very best we can, given the climate that we're facing and the restrictions that are in front of us, right? If somebody said to me, recently, one of the local journalists said, okay, what's the one thing that you would do over again? I hate that question, by the way. If given the opportunity,
That's my next question, Steve.
Right. I would not have done hybrid learning. We would have formed a dedicated school or program in which kids we're not going to get the free flow back and forth from jumping a hybrid, come back in person, as COVID numbers fluctuate. I would have not done it. I had no idea what that toll was going to take on our teachers and on our parents and on our students. So, but hindsight's always 20/20, right? And those of us that have been leading districts for a while, we know this. It's okay to reflect back if the same circumstance happens again, but we better start looking forward because there's a ton of pressure on us to really narrow these gaps going forward.
I want to just remind everybody, we're talking to Dr. Susan Enfield, Dr. Michael Duncan, and Dr. Steve Joel, superintendents representing three states across the country on topics that I think are very important for communities and practitioners within the classroom. I want to thank those that are bringing this conversation to bear. I want to thank Strategist Group for developing and influencing through change expertise, and our friends at EDSB, the K-12 platform of the future today. Susan, I want to bring up, I think this is core to teachers that I speak with and really core to parents, which is social emotional learning. If there's ever something in there that runs the risk of being sort of left to the side because we are trying to keep our heads above water, it is how we're dealing with social emotional learning, not just for our students, but our teachers, and really sort of that exchange, that relationship that they have, and then the role that the parent or the caregiver plays. How have you approached it? What are those discussions? What do they look like? Because it feels like it was a nice to have, right? SEL. We could talk about it as a district and we would, show improvements, but the anxiety levels, like there's just so many sort of elements that I think need to be addressed. And then if we're in a world where we have hybrid learning, to Steve's point, or how we're approaching this, it feels like it should be almost at the top of the list, that we are integrating it in, not as a nice to have, but a must have, and that it's relational to our teaching and learning, that it's documented, that it's tracked, so that we're creating this supportive net around not only our classrooms, but the kids within those classrooms?
Sure. So I'm going to start my answer the way I started my answer for the last sort of set of questions around trust and communications. It's relationships. So those of us who began our careers as teachers, as I did many, many years ago, we weren't talking about social emotional learning in the classroom back in the early 90s when I was a brand new classroom teacher. But I knew, every good educator has always known, that you have to build relationships with your students, relationships that are built on mutual respect and understanding and a genuine desire to learn about who that student is, where they come from, what they need. And so that has always been, as I think it has been for so many of our educators across the nation, that has always been central to who I am as a teacher. And once a teacher, always a teacher, and now as an administrator. And so I've carried that with me, and I'm fortunate that in Highline, we've had a very deep commitment to social emotional learning integration for many, many years, really since I came here in 2012. And I think one of the greatest examples of that is our Highline Promise that I know my friend Steve is well aware of, that rather than a mission or vision, we make a promise to our students, to our families, to our community, that every student in Highline will be known by name, strength, and need, and graduate prepared for the future they choose. Now, when the pandemic hit and our students were all of a sudden, well, not just our students, all of us were sort of thrust into our homes to have to figure out how to relate and learn remotely, I realized that we were going to have to figure out how to operationalize that promise in ways like never before. And so we made a commitment in Highline to making sure every student had a one-to-one adult connection at their school. And we asked our schools to essentially assign an adult in the school to every student, and that adult would check in with that student every week, to not just to check in, how are you, but to build a relationship, because it was so essential for our children to know that even though they were at home and not physically in school, that their school community was still intact, that the adults in that school still knew them, still cared about them, and were still going to interact with them. And this is work that we are continuing this year. We actually, on September 13th, was a non-instructional day, and it was our family engagement day. And our teachers and staff spent the entire day just connecting with their students' families, building those relationships, asking families, what do you want me to know about your child or young person? These weren't academic conversations. This wasn't, well, the data says that your student is 2 years behind in reading. These were conversations such as, Rod, I really want to know what your fourth grade son is looking forward to this year. What are your hopes for him? What do you need from me? And how can we work together to make sure that he has a really successful school year? So, I think that sort of building those relationships in an ongoing way is critically important. Now, I will also say that, just equating social emotional learning to building relationships should not let us off the hook for having very intentional social emotional strategies in place. And in Highline, we have had a partnership with Ruler out of Yale and Mark Brackett's work for many years. So we actually years ago published our 3 essential cell practices for the classroom. And we have a corresponding 3 essential cell practices for adults. So whether it's a 3rd grade morning meeting, a cabinet meeting in my team, a meeting of a principal and their staff, we have 3 core components that we all adhere to. We begin with some kind of a welcoming ritual that typically is a check-in. And we do this in my cabinet meeting. How is everyone feeling today? And what do you need to be successful from all of us? Takes, 5-10 minutes, critically important. Because if I know how Mike's feeling today, and if Mike's having a rough day as his colleague, I'm going to know how to work with Mike in the context of that conversation. We then go to second, engaging communication practices. How are we intentional in either how we structure a lesson, or equally important, how we structure a meeting so that the expectations and outcomes are clear. And finally, an optimistic close. And I got to tell you, there are days where it's hard to find an optimistic close, but we really discipline ourselves to do that. And I share this to say that we as the adults have to model and live the good practices that are social emotional learning. It's not just about how we're teaching it to our kids, it's how are we living it as the adults? Because if we can't model it as the adults, our kids are never going to learn it. And so that's something that we've really been committed to in Highline, and that I'm very proud of how our staff has embraced that as central, not as ancillary, but as central to our work as educators who are committed to knowing every child by name, strength, and need.
No, and I really love, that's going to stick with me, that operationalizing the promise. Mike, Susan brought up data, and it's interesting because data sort of is a dirty word in education and probably in other sectors as well, right? We need it, but then we're not exactly sure how to use it. It looks like we're probably pulling in different points of data at this juncture in education, and I'm wondering, this kind of goes a little bit to what I was talking with Steve about, which is this, where is our confidence level when it comes to our ability to understand the data that's coming in? When we're talking what Susan's saying about, this environment, it's about the relationship, right? There are different data points today than there were 18 months ago. And I'm wondering how we are looking at data. Are we creating a different relationship with data that is more impactful? Whether it's in how we support our teachers and or how we're documenting learning, how we're packaging that and understanding it within the context of SEL. Is our relationship getting better with data, and what do we need to do to improve that relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rod. And I so love what Susan said. So I just wanted to comment on that SEL work that they're doing there. What was really interesting to me, Rod, is we did not take the state accountability test in the spring of 2020, and the earth continued to spin and we continued to have the seasons. And so what it really pointed to me was that we have to have measures, but are we measuring enough, and are we measuring the right things? And that's a constant conversation that we have. And of course, through ESSA, we all have our state mandated tests that we have to give. Our state made a decision to go to the absolute minimum number of state tests that we're giving now going forward. But what we realized was that our formative data, our data on our performance tasks that we give at the end of each unit, cornerstone task that we give at the end of each year, and then our capstone experiences and transitional grades were much more informative in helping us understand where our students were. So it really was not the state mandated, the fairly mandated standardized testing that was the data that was most important to us. It was the idea of those tests measure what kids know, but our internal assessments measure what students can do with what they know. And that became a very powerful lever for us in continuing to move our mission forward, but also to have really meaningful conversations with parents about how we accelerate those competencies and skills to help students move and close the gap. Because much like Steve said, we did have a limited number of students that chose a virtual option because they had high risk factors in their home. And so we accommodated them to the best of our ability. Our early formative data this fall demonstrated us that they were significantly behind. The longer that they were out in virtual learning, the further they were behind. And so taking an acceleration model with those students and having going back to how we spent the ESSER funds, having an incredibly robust summer program that honestly we've not been able to have in our community for a very long time because a fund was really essential. So I would say our relationship with data, for us, it kind of reinforced that our state standardized testing data was not something that we have always relied on heavily. It was more our internal assessments that gave us the information we need to have really authentic conversations with our parents. And so I would say that doubling down and having a more robust formative assessment system and not relying on the autopsy of state standardized testing just reinforced a lot of the conversations that we had been having for years.
How do we guard, Mike, against just reporting on data? A frustration from the parent side is data that is actionable, that is understandable, that, not that it's common sense, but that actually links to the learning that is going on. It feels like there are some major potholes in the progression of data being captured and then how that gets disseminated and either reported and or provided in an environment that is engaging and it invites engagement. How do you sort of approach that or think about that if that's a criticism of the industry?
Well, I believe if your instructional design is really about standardization of tasks and standardization of assessments throughout the year, I think you find yourself struggling to have those conversations. But for us, in the way that we are looking at the data that we are curating inside our district, we're able to have much more robust conversations with parents, because a parent can see a percentile rank, they can see a scale score. Most don't really understand what that means until we interpret it for them. But when they see an example of student work against the expectation for that student work, therein lies that opportunity to build that self-directed learning as those students are communicating their goal persistence and achievement of their goals and obtainment with their parents. And so doing that through a digital portfolio process where parents have the opportunity to see artifacts of learning that students are curating that are then tagged to our competencies and to our standards, create the kind of robust parent engagement that we really want from our parents. But when we're just having conversations about numbers and percentile ranks and scale scores, a lot of parents are going to get lost in that conversation. But when they look at their actual students' work against the standard and against the expectation, now we're having a really rich conversation. So we're piloting this year, having parents provide commentary on student artifacts of learning. And so really engaging parents in a much more meaningful way. We always say we want parent engagement until we get it, because oftentimes we don't know what we're asking for. So this is a way that we can really stay true to developing creative problem solvers and talking about those competencies that we are fostering and measuring in each grade level, and having authentic performances and authentic work for parents to see and interact with. And so our relationship hasn't changed much, but it's given me a much taller soapbox to yell from about why the vision that we are on is so important, and trying to proselytize other districts around Georgia into being more intentional about gathering evidence of student transfer of learning and not just depending solely on standardization of scores.
I appreciate, Mike, bringing up sort of that portfolio approach, because I think probably more parents than less actually want to be a part of that intermediate, right? They want to get included into that conversation so that if there's a response to the intervention, that we can actually play an active role and support in a conversation, right? In the dinner talk with kids, these sorts of things. Steve, I want to circle back. In a previous executive session, one of your colleagues in Texas, Dr. Quentin Shepard of Victoria Independent School District, he wrote an op-ed around noticing, like what we notice. And it was just, I thought, very compelling, because we're moving at a rapid rate. We're trying to build trust and operationalize promises. See, Susan, that's going to stick with me. That phrase. What have you noticed in your 35 years that really could be thought of as sage advice? Because we were saying off camera before we started our discussion today, just, those superintendents that are either brand new in their position. I know a handful that retired early. It was one of these, it was just sort of a natural time for them to leave and sort of integrate in new blood. But, from the parent side, we do want to make sure that we've got the Steve Joels of the world in the seat that you're in, communicating about what's been learned over the last 35 years so that we don't make rash or harsh decisions, and we can be really thoughtful about that portfolio approach. Because it does feel like, we said it for years, it takes a village. Well, now we're living that and hoping that our technology, our staff, and our mission, that they're all married together. So what kind of advice do you have when you look back over 35 years? Obviously, this is the first pandemic that you've experienced, hopefully, unless I missed something in your bio.
Last one too. So I love that op-ed that Quentin wrote. So for me, it's really this, and Susan said it, and Mike alluded to it. We have to build relationships, right? As an educational leader, superintendent, and we're talking about relationships at every single level, from the custodial team to the transportation team to, people without kids in schools. The successful superintendents are the ones that network, connect, and really strengthen that foundation. I also have always taken great interest, and I think you and I talked about this a few other times, Rod, in the mentoring of superintendents that get that first job. They're very idealistic. They're going to set the world on fire. I did too. Susan did too. Mike did too. And then, if we're not closely aligned with a high quality mentor, we get slapped in the face very, very quickly, if not the second or third day of the year. And too many superintendents that I know take wrong positions because it either represents an increase in compensation, a better location, some status, and they really are not able to manage that successfully. The carnage right now, measured by vacancies, I think is more than it's ever been in all of my years. At least the conversations that I've had with close friends and colleagues that are trying to figure out what exactly happened. I mean, why before the pandemic were things seemingly pretty good, and now post-pandemic, which happened to coincide with the election of the presidential election and the storming of the Capitol. Why all of a sudden has that played itself out in my boardroom, and why have I kind of shrunk in status with regard to my board? And I think too often superintendents don't do a very good job of managing that. Now, I'm one that would say, we have to build. Experience tells me this. I never had to worry about my position in Lincoln. I'd built up enough political capital, enough community capital, board capital, that no matter what decision I make, short of something that was unethical or immoral or illegal, we were going to weather this one way or the other, right? But too many superintendents got caught up in those winds of fury that they just couldn't figure out, and they were either asked to leave or they came to their own belief system that it was time to go. And some are still trying to search right now because it's still a difficult environment to go out there. So what I've noticed is that the carnage on leadership, the attacks on leadership, have probably been more pronounced than ever before. And as Susan and Mike both know, the networks that we're in, not only in our states but in our nation, we have to provide support for those folks because there really isn't much of that existing within either their home district or their home state. The other thing I've noticed is this, and I'll go to my grave saying this as loudly as I can: invest in the best people you can invest in. And, I always, even in Lincoln, boards would say to me, well, can't we save money with that assistant superintendent position based on what the other person was making? And I say, no, and we're not going to. In fact, I'm going to increase it by several thousand because we're going to hold them to some really high expectations. And we need all stars in our midst, people who can fight through this, because as everybody knows, right now, there's a bunch of teachers, a bunch of principals, and a bunch of superintendents across the country that are questioning whether or not they're in the right profession. We have to have people that never waver with that. They have to say, yes, I'm in the right profession. This happens to be one of those challenging times, but I'm going to be better as a result of it. And I'm going to do it not in isolation, but as part of a high-performing team.
Thank you for that, Steve. I want to close with this, Micah. Just as an observation, I've noticed you take notes as your colleagues are talking, and it's the power of the network that Steve was talking about, I think. Can you just speak to that continuous learner in you? Because I think, one, it's fantastic just modeling in general. I think it's also nice to see that as adults, that we are passionate not just about leading, but also about practicing what we preach, what we hopefully lead amongst our teams. And you've been taking notes from your colleagues here, and it's celebrating like childlike kind of. I love that. There's a mirroring to that I think we need, right? There's a lot of seriousness in the profession. Can you talk a little bit about your experience just in the networking and the conversation that you're having here today?
Well, I was, taking notes. I've always had two philosophies as just personally as a superintendent. Number one, say yes to everything. Just say yes. There's so many amazing opportunities that come your way and so many great learnings and just through serendipity and happenstance, when you just say yes. And, say yes. So when Rod emails me and says, hey, I want to talk to you, absolutely, I'll talk to you. I don't know if I have anything important to say or really anything insightful to say, but yeah, man, I'll talk to you, because look, I get on here with this call, and for 54 minutes, I've had an opportunity to start jotting down all of these notes and all this wisdom from these superintendents. So the other principle is take something away from everyone. Everyone in this profession has a unique perspective, They have wisdom that is hard earned. And if I can take a little of Steve's wisdom and a little of Susan's wisdom today, and there was already really some great ideas and things that they said in the way that they frame some of the work that they're doing, where I've already thought, I can't wait to talk to my team about the Pike Promise. Because wow, we've really been struggling with how we communicate our SEL work and how we package that and really gain some traction. So Susan, I say thank you to that. So I wrote that down. I'm like, man, I need to talk to my team. That I think we got a really awesome nugget here, and just things like that were just so important as we try to create this network of learners. And I, like Steve, and I appreciate him saying it, that the networks we have not only in our state but outside of our state are so important because it allows us to have a perspective outside the state. And some of my greatest learnings have come from friends in Pennsylvania and California and Colorado and Michigan. And that is so far away from the deep South. And the work that these folks are engaged in is so different than perhaps what we're focusing on here in Georgia. And so I think, for superintendents, they're trying to really keep their feet on the ground and think about what's next and really open their mind to be a learner. I would just so strongly encourage them to be a part of those networks that allow you to gain a national perspective, because there's just so many amazing people out there that you can learn from. And I have been the beneficiary of just cultivating great friendships and relationships over the years that have helped me learn so much. And give me ideas about how to further my journey. Because, I always tell my folks, if we are only as good as I am, we are in deep trouble. And so it's, building the capacity of your team, but it's going out there and talking to great superintendents and veteran superintendents like Susan and Steve. To me, that has just been one of the, over the 17 years, it's just been one of the things I'm most grateful for, is to have these opportunities to hear from two leaders I don't really know personally, but now I do. And now I can reach out to these folks. So it is so important for the superintendent to always be the lead learner and to admit that they're on a learning journey all the time.
Thank you for that, Mike. Susan, I'm going to close. We're going to give you the closing word here. So I would imagine, because I've met you through national platforms and this, you do not keep yourself isolated to your community. You're always leaning into national conversations and your colleagues, your contemporaries around the U.S. How important has it been over the last 18 months to have these connections that Mike alluded to, in different states, to be able to have conversations that sort of step you outside of your immediate community, but allow for professional learning and then application locally?
Yeah, so I've always said that district leadership is a team sport. And I think, to build on what Mike just said, as a leader is only as good as their team. And, I'm really blessed to work with an extraordinary team in Highline, from my board to my senior leadership team to my principals, teachers, custodians, everybody. It's a really phenomenal team here in the district. But I would say, too, that as a superintendent, we are an N of one in our districts. And so, networking and having these opportunities to learn from one another isn't a nice to have, it's a have to have. You are not going to sustain yourself in this work if you don't have a strong network of superintendent colleagues that you can turn to in good times and bad, to learn from and be, buoyed by, for lack of a better term. So, and that happens in formal and informal ways. So, we all look forward to the AASA meeting in February, because for 3 or 4 days, we're all together, and we're not an N of one in that moment. But I think that I don't talk to a superintendent today who didn't have a core group of fellow superintendent colleagues they weren't turning to on a regular basis over the last 18 months. So, and I have a number of different networks that I have relied on. And I also think, too, I think as leaders, it's important that we balance being courageous and being vulnerable all at once. And this has not been an easy road for anybody. And I think that being able to say to our community, I'm struggling right now. This is hard. I don't have the answers to this solution. And I know that we have people in our community who are struggling and hurting, but I'm committed to finding the answers. And then having superintendents that you can call on, like Steve, and just say, Steve, I'm not sure I can leave my house tomorrow and go back and do this job. and have someone really sort of, talk to you and say, no, you can do this, and here are some tools. It's made all the difference. And I'm just so grateful for my superintendent friends and colleagues, and just so proud, so incredibly proud to be in a profession of people whose commitment to children and equity and delivering on the best of what our nation can be has been on full display over the last 18 months under incredibly hard circumstances. It's a really, really, really wonderful thing to be a part of.
Well, I think these conversations are impactful, not just for leaders around the country that are in school systems, but I think for parents as well, to get to understand the people behind the label or the title. I really want to thank Dr. Susan Enfield, Dr. Michael Duncan, Dr. Steve Joel for their transparency and the human approach that you bring to very human challenges. It inspires people like me who get to, are afforded the opportunity to speak with leaders like yourself, and also as a parent. So I appreciate your time and your commitment to the conversation today. We also want to thank those that helped bring this conversation together. We'd like to thank Strategist Group, developing and influencing through change expertise, and to our friends at EDSB, the K-12 platform of the future today. I'm your host, Dr. Rod Berger.